Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to come and share in some both reflection and observation that I hope will be useful to you. The topic of this conference, growing national prosperity, is a huge challenge. In fact, the very challenge that drew me as a young leader into politics in New Zealand. I wanted to just begin by providing that context, because unless I do so, whatever I say will be relatively meaningless. I was in the office as a minister from 1990 through to just under the eve of the millennium when we lost the election during the period that I was Prime Minister. I personally chose to go into politics because New Zealand then needed a step change. To be fair, I was a leader. I was a leader as a child. I was nurtured as a leader by my family. I dared to believe that women, alongside our male colleagues, should be making the decisions for the future. And so in my mid-30s, I decided, along with a group of other younger New Zealanders, that felt that unless there was a step change in New Zealand, we would run the grave risk of being isolated. Remember the context. We had been feeding Europe, and it had been historically a comfortable space. But the world was changing dramatically. The political discourse at the time was to try and protect rather than open up, and my generation of leader saw that as entirely unsustainable. The second thing that drove me into politics is a genuine belief that to serve our citizens well, we need to be thinking about what we can do to induce meaningful prosperity in their eyes, and also to create a sense of security, which today is not just about defence, it's about sustainability. And it's about the concepts of investment that yield returns in both human and financial terms in the short and medium term. So in my early 30s, I was arrogant enough to think that I could make a contribution. And I genuinely thought that I had a right to be at the table. And so along with others, I succeeded in getting selected in one of the political parties, which often for women is the challenge, and then elected in a very safe seat, or a seat that I made very safe for the balance of my political career. The third thing that's important for you to understand was the environment. New Zealand had been running fiscal deficits for 17 years and accumulating massive public debt. I happen to believe, as a mother of two young children, that this seemed rather unintelligent, and it was clearly unsustainable. There were a number of leading politicians at the time who also felt committed to try and change the government and also change the track, to try and think about how we would get our economy back in balance. And then, of course, the electoral reality. So in 1990, we did succeed in winning by an overwhelming majority. And the first cabinet meeting was an enormous shock, because almost everything we promised as a political party, we then had to walk away from, because the fiscal position was in deficit, not surplus, as our predecessors had asserted. And in fact, the BNZ was on its knees, and we had to take some very dramatic decisions, which was politically relevant because we had made significant promises. And you know politically that if you make promises and then for whatever reason cannot or choose not to deliver on them, that can have significant political consequences. I well remember that first cabinet meeting where ministers had to grapple with whether we would continue to do what we had said we would do and simply repeat history of accumulating deficits or debt, or whether we were prepared to lead and govern, which we'd been clearly elected to do. I'm proud to tell you in retrospect that, and I would do this again today, by the way, that we not only got on and did what was right, rather than focusing only on what was popular, but the package of programs that we were able to deliver really addressed many structural issues facing New Zealand at that time, which have allowed the growth platforms that have subsequently been seen in New Zealand to be built upon. One of the tests that I think all of us, both politicians and those who serve the public interest through the public sector, should always ask is whether what you're doing is likely to be durable. I remember the headlines of that time around welfare reform, for example, for which I was responsible as welfare minister from 90 to 93, some of which was very, very demanding. We cut welfare benefits very significantly. we succeeded in getting our popularity to drop from the mid-40s to 17%. And I well remember the headlines of one-term government. Some of you will be familiar with the book that says, in order to succeed, you need to do something 10,000 times. I can remember saying 10,000 times or more that you cannot have people on welfare earning more than people in work. That was the reality of New Zealand in 1990, and so rightly or wrongly, we took on that challenge. How did we do it? Well, it was obviously a policy question, an implementation question, and a communication question. We decided to try and ensure that the public of New Zealand knew what we were doing by sending out over 1 million booklets to each household that actually showed what people were getting in each of the different categories of welfare and what the changes would do to implement so that people could think about families they knew, members of their families, or they as workers, whether they viewed this as fair. History tells you that despite the demanding nature of that and many other reforms, the government was re-elected again in 1993. I guess my message under the headline of our question today, if I knew now what, or if we knew then what we know now, would we have done the same thing? You bet your life. We would have and should have. And while I've still got scars, dare I say it, to prove that these were demanding times, it was unquestionably the right thing to do for New Zealand. There were many other changes that happened during that time that were critical to getting New Zealand into a dynamic environment again where they could engage both effectively as an economy at home but also relevantly as an economy engaging internationally. And so the markets that we'd relied on for 30 to 40 years started to diversify. There are many, many programs we undertook, and if I was to summarise them, it was moving from a closed to an open economy. There was the labour market reform, which was around flexibility, highly unpopular with the unions, and yet critical to the flexible nature of the New Zealand economy today. And many of the cliches that were run by the then left, in fact, have proven to be entirely untrue in New Zealand. In my experience for women, for example, flexible labour markets allow women to choose how they will participate. And many women, particularly when they want to go in and out of the labour market while they are bringing children along with them, flexibility as opposed to rigidity is a huge advantage. It's also been very critical in some of the innovative policy areas that we undertook. And while it's too short a time today to cover them, I want to just address one or two. While we often talk about PPPs in the infrastructure area, one of the greatest successes, in my opinion, from New Zealand's public-private participation work in the early 90s was shifting from public provision of aged care to public funding but private provision of aged care across the board. It was a huge and massive transition, which was needs-based rather than entitlement-based. So rather than an arbitrary unit funding, we shifted to a highly responsive individual needs assessment and then choice. Unsurprisingly, the age of people in rest homes went from about 64 to low 80s in less than 5 years. And that wasn't because we insisted that it changed, we facilitated choice. And so by allowing the private sector to deliver home-based care, and a lot of community organisations also became home-based care providers, very many diverse providers emerged in the full-time and hospital care, and today public provision of those beds is virtually non-existent. And yet I would argue that New Zealand's aged care packages are some of the leading and most innovative that you will find worldwide. I can't go past history without also dealing with fiscal responsibility. People often ask why, as a small economy, we still rate as open and transparent. Well, if I can go back to that cabinet meeting, the frustration I felt when we had been, and I use the word cheated with qualification, but I felt politically cheated because I had been told one thing and yet the reality was another. New Zealand's fiscal responsibility legislation today simply does not allow that to occur. The Treasury publishes our accounts quarterly with no interference whatsoever from the political process, so that the public, the political parties, and most importantly, the media are fully informed on the financial circumstances and the balance sheet of our country. And so today, if a politician starts promising anything, immediately they are asked how they're going to pay for it. And it's created a dynamic and a balance that's absolutely critical in the transparency of New Zealand today. So what would I do now if I had the chance again? There's very little I would change, and I can't go through all the areas of reform for which I was responsible, but I want to leave these things with you. I was with Malcolm Fraser and Tony Blair, and we were in front of one of the new Korean presidents some years ago, and he asked us before his inauguration what we would do if we had the chance again. It may or may not surprise you to know that each of the three of us said we would go further, faster, if we had the chance. Now, that may sound reckless to you as people who lead public policy and public service, but as leaders, I think the sense that you're given this opportunity to make change is rare, and it's very exquisite but very important that you don't squander that opportunity. It was also said, though, in the context of our now experience as retired politicians, that markets are also changing much more rapidly than generally our public sectors are able to adjust. And so as we look and ask the question around how do we facilitate national prosperity, we can't do anything other than engage in global markets and the reality of those markets as well. And so the knowledge of taking the full picture into account, moving quickly and adaptively in order to respond to what we saw not only at home but abroad, in our observation was very critical. So further, faster. The second thing I would do is watch the language of reform. It's very abstract and very hard. In reality, what we're trying to do is shift resources in a way that is fit for purpose and meaningful for the generation with whom we are seeking to serve. And both the political leadership and the public sector leadership, in my opinion, need to think about what is the language of consumers' rights and their desire to be able to be prosperous, and whether you're facilitating that or impeding it, because they have a view. And to serve them well, I think the language of reform is critical. The third thing I would do would be more cautious about reference to the OECD, and I apologise to all of you from the OECD in this audience. In the mid-90s, and certainly by the time I was Prime Minister in 97, 98, 99, the reality of the world's political and economic framework has changed. And yet many of us, including New Zealand, and to some extent, if I might correct my observation in Australia, is we often reference our club of the OECD. Now, frankly, the work the OECD has done over the years is brilliant. Please don't misunderstand me. But the question of what are the reference points that are fit for purpose, where you're designing public policy for an economy that used to comfortably couch itself in the developed world of 1 billion or 1.2 billion people and could bluntly disregard the rest. The markets of today do not look like that. They are the developed economies sitting within what are now rapidly developing, if not developed economies, with populations representing of the 7+ billion people on Earth, probably between 4 or 5 billion. And unless you as public servants and public policy leaders and I as a politician are informed and engaged, then we can't even ask the question, how do we facilitate prosperity at home and relevance abroad if we're not turning our minds to this? I regret not visiting more of the developing economies that are now the powerhouses when I was in my mid-years as a minister. To be fair, in preparation for APEC, I got a chance to do just that, and it was a complete and utter revelation. And if I did have a chance to get another 3 years, I can tell you that Asia and emerging Africa would have been at the centre of the New Zealand public policy framework alongside our established economies that we were engaging with. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is the issue of, how do I say this politely in Australia, the concept of coalition building and minorities. And this is important. As you know, in New Zealand, we adopted MMP in 1996, so I had the experience as Prime Minister of managing a coalition and a minority government during the period that I led. This brings both challenge but opportunity. And I've already been asked today, why on earth did New Zealand adopt MMP? Honestly, that's a decade and a half's story ago. In my observation, including in Australia, populations are insisting that minority views are represented in politics. And the days of clean-cut majorities may well be behind us. Are you, as a public service, fit for purpose to assist governments to think about how to formulate strategy and policy that accommodate minority views? I can tell you that we were completely blind at the beginning, but our current Prime Minister and certainly other Prime Ministers and leaders of minority parties have become very sophisticated in saying it's not what we're against, although they're against a heap of stuff, but rather what are they for? And so the public service and the body politic now has to learn to work in a way that both accommodates and then facilitates good government. And it's a learning process, and I want to leave it with you as a challenge and an observation that I don't think it matters where you are. Skills like this will be required both by political leaders and the public service if you are to serve your public interest well. The final issue I would put, if I were to do things differently, even though I was the first woman leader, would be to have a more diverse cabinet. And while I had women ministers in my group, my observation both during my political time and then subsequently in my commercial career, I chair a number of companies both in New Zealand and have served on one of the major banks in China, for example, for 6 years, where you've got diverse boards of both women and men, and diverse experience represented in that mix. You view risk differently and you grasp opportunity more broadly. It's simply a fact. And so the days of being able to argue that this is not relevant or there aren't women available, frankly, if I heard that argument promoted in front of me, I wouldn't want to really be responsible for the way in which I would respond. Let me put this to you. There isn't a political party on earth that cannot justify selecting capable women and men to serve the public they seek to lead. Full stop. Secondly, cabinets should under no circumstances be dominant by one gender or another. I think societies are entitled to think that talent, both diverse and actual, are sitting around the table allocating resources and defining the rules. In the public service, if you are daring to put up public policy as advice to government, it is inexcusable, in my opinion, that leaders and second-level reports and third-level reports are not diverse in this day and age. And if they are not, in developed societies like New Zealand and Australia, it is simply time that that changed. Why do I feel so strongly about this? Well, in both my political career and in my business career, the evidence where I've been able to be involved where that balance has occurred, the quality of decision-making and the sustainability of the decisions we've made are far more enduring. And even more than that, those of you who are following the research post the GFC, where women and men were together on boards, those companies fell less far and recovered more quickly. So where there were more than 2 women directors and or more than 3 women in the senior report structures, there are now 4 global reports that have observed this phenomena. And the only conclusion they have been able to draw is that that view of risk is broader and the way in which opportunities are both analysed and then considered as part of strategy are also broader. So if you think about it from an economic point of view and a leadership point of view, if we are to serve our societies well, diversity matters. I would go one step further. Our New Zealand and Australian economies, while they have done extremely well in our old world relationships, and in the last decade we have made a fortune, relatively speaking, working and serving the new emerging economy of China in particular. Are we really understanding the diverse aspects and questions and curiosity of the consumers of the new middle classes? If we don't have diversity in our leadership, in public policy and in politics, our ability to have sustainable relationships, whether it's in foreign policy or in economic development, in my view, is limited, unless we are genuinely understanding that diversity is good business from a New Zealand and Australian point of view. I think it's nothing to do with political correctness, by the way. I think where you see this at its best, it goes straight to the bottom line in terms of reward. And I hope I can challenge each of you in your areas of leadership and responsibility to reflect on this in terms of building a stronger New Zealand and Australia at home, but also a more effective New Zealand and Australia abroad. I want to conclude my comments this afternoon by just dwelling on achievements. And honestly, we could be here all day, and also mistakes. I would simply say that, of course, you succeed in some areas and you also fail in others. But the question of how you define success as a political leader is critical here. I came into politics to change things. I'm a reformer. And so when I got caught as Prime Minister with the Asian economic crisis, there is an official in this room who said to me, "Jenny, you don't have to get back into surplus in 1 year." And I understood that. But actually, I came into politics to defeat this 17 years in a row deficit pattern, and I was not going to let a languid sort of attitude toward a deficit that had emerged because of the Asian economic crisis simply be how I would be branded as a former Prime Minister. And so I paid attention to that. So while I did not win the 1999 election, that's clearly a fact, I did leave New Zealand with an over $2 billion surplus at that time and a growth rate in excess of 4%. That was success for me. And so today, when I ask myself again, would I do the same thing? You bet your life I would do the same thing, because I decided as a leader that that was in the public interest of that time. And while others are entitled to judge differently, I think in both political leadership and in public service, you need to listen carefully to that relationship that emerges when elections occur, or indeed engagement around events and policy debate occurs, that you stay attuned. And so what of the future if I was to leave you with a challenge? Well, change is the norm. So any of you who are uncomfortable with that, if you can't cope with it, I don't think you should be in the public sector. If you can, on the other hand, are you fit for purpose? Today and tomorrow will be quite different to yesterday. And do we have the right people at the table to give us advice? I think the static nature of public service and public sector of yesterday is not sustainable for tomorrow, because it's not what we know that is our risk, it's what we don't know. And of the things we don't know, we have to have an appetite to be able to inquire and have access to people who know where these communities are. Talk to your children. I have two in their mid-30s, and I'm astonished in the world that they live in. The concept of sovereign borders is an anathema to them. And yet our generation was raised thinking about a prosperous nation. They think about engagement in the world, and so their communities and our public service and political leadership have to somehow align. And so I want to challenge you around those concepts. I also want to leave that diversity question with you. I felt increasingly anxious about this. Diversity around the tables of our major decision-making platforms are critical. The G7 is an inexcusable yesterday's club of people who are not necessarily serving the interests of tomorrow. The G20, by the way, is, in my view, the most critical conversation vehicle of our time, and you as Australians are going to host this immensely important event later this year. Don't let it get institutionalised. Don't write the press statement before the meeting happens, even though I know that's what you do. Don't treat your leaders so unintelligently that they can't actually grapple with the issues of our time when they meet. It is one of the greatest values of bringing leaders together, as APEC and the G20 can do. But more importantly, the G20 is more representative of the world that Australia and New Zealand lives in. And so I hope you and New Zealanders here, you as Australians and New Zealanders who are here, will champion the voice of the emerging economies upon whom both New Zealand and Australia rely so heavily, but also on a fairness and equity and relevance basis. The G20 is an extremely important vehicle. Which brings me to my final comment. Your Prime Minister, Prime Minister Abbott, is talking about inclusive growth. Inclusion is a critical concept. That doesn't mean you have to try and think about welfare and equity. Social inclusion, recognising difference and yet finding common ground, is a very critical concept. New Zealand has spent 30 years trying to think more carefully about this with some very significant success. And in my own opinion, with the diversification of the global economy, successful inclusion, shared societies that are safe for difference, both at home and abroad, are key concepts for the future, and I want to leave that with you as something to grapple with. Thank you very much.